Welcome to the Introduction to Landscape Photography. In this section, we're going to talk about all the basic things you need to know about landscape photography before we move into the field. For some of you, this is going to be really basic, so if you already feel like you have a strong working knowledge of photography, feel free to skip ahead to the next section. You guys have already seen me cover a ton of different gear, but just getting started out in landscape photography, you don't need to have all of that stuff. All you're really going to need is a tripod, a camera, and at least one lens. I'd start out with wide, and then wide to medium would also be a good idea. As I mentioned, I have a lot of gear, but I didn't start out that way. I've accumulated that gear over time as my needs and types of photography that I've tried to capture have increased over time. And if you think about different types of photographers, like sports photographers, they're gonna want really long telephoto lenses that are ultra fast. Wedding photographers want really expensive fast lenses. But for landscape photography, I think it's a little bit more simple because we're really working with a lot of wide angles and we're focused on shooting at low ISOs at f8. So it's not that important to have the most expensive gear or a lot of different gear. In the beginning, it's just good to focus on the things that you're going to be shooting the most and centering the gear that you purchase around that. So in this case, and for a lot of the stuff that we cover in this entire tutorial, that's going to be done with just a wide or a medium lens. When I first got into photography, I was really confused about the varying prices of lenses. And if you're just getting into it today, then you might be confused as well. So let's talk about it. Why would a lens that's 28 to 300 cost less than half the price of a lens that's 24 to 70? So this is the 28 to 300 for the Nikon, and it's about $800. This is the 24 to 70, and it's about $2,000. Well, there's a few reasons. The main reason is the fixed aperture rating. So this is a solid f2.8, while this is a 3.5 to 5.6. Throughout this tutorial, I'm going to explain exactly what f-stop means, but basically that means that no matter how I shoot, whether it's at 24 or 70 millimeters, that aperture rating will stay at f2.8, where this starts at 3.5, and when I go to 300, turns to 5.6. Now I said for this tutorial we're going to do a lot of shooting at f8, so this lens is completely adequate. I know everything's going to be sharp. Now I also know for a fact with these two lenses that this lens is slightly sharper than this, but with the fixed aperture rating of f2.8, I have more specialty things I can do. I can shoot the night sky, or I can get beautiful soft focus behind subjects, where this one limits my ability to do that because of its fixed aperture rating of 3.5 instead of 2.8. In this case with landscape photography, you're more than fine to use this lens. You don't really have to spring for the extra cost of this solid f2.8 24 to 70. But if you're going to get into different types of subjects, shooting people, moving subjects, sports, you want that soft focus look, or you want to start shooting the night sky at f2.8, then it may be worth investing in this in the future. Throughout this tutorial, I'll also be shooting with two different cameras. I'll be shooting with the Nikon D810, which is currently the sharpest and highest megapixel camera that Nikon makes. It's a full frame DSLR. I'll also be using the Fujifilm X-T1, which is an APS-C or crop sensor, which I'll explain a little bit throughout this tutorial. It's 16 megapixels, but each one, I feel that these are both incredibly sharp, and I'm not really convinced that megapixels matter these days depending on what you're working on. If you're going to do giant wall-size prints, I've seen 16 megapixels fill the wall without any problems at all, just like 36. So this is also a full-frame DSLR. This is a mirrorless camera, so throughout the tutorial, I'm going to try to mix it up a little bit, give you guys examples of using a mirrorless camera and a DSLR. So don't worry too much about which one you have. They're both amazing pieces of technology, but the advantage of APS-C and mirrorless bodies is that they're much more compact and suited for travel. In the context of landscape photography, and this tutorial in particular, high ISO performance isn't really going to matter too much, so I'm really always trying to shoot at the lowest ISO possible. So both of these cameras will work perfectly in the field. It's interesting too that historically DSLR cameras have been the champions of the past, but now mirrorless cameras are becoming the new champions of the future. And they're also much cheaper. For the same price as an entry-level DSLR, I can get a full-featured mirrorless camera. So it's also a great investment in not only the future of how photography is progressing, but it's going to give you more features and more power for less cost. Regarding tripods, do you need to buy the most expensive tripod on the market? Absolutely not, but you're gonna have to have something if you want to be a landscape photographer. I know wedding photographers that don't even own tripods because they do everything with flash, all handheld. But unless you're gonna shoot landscapes in the middle of the afternoon, which we are certainly not gonna do to get the best shots, you're gonna need stability, you're gonna have to be starting to do longer exposures, so you're gonna have to invest in a tripod. So you don't have to break the bank all at once, but you want to make sure that when you buy a tripod, you check the weight rating. You want to make sure that the tripod supports the total weight of your camera body plus your heaviest lens. So that's very important. Another really important thing to take into consideration when purchasing a tripod is the height of the tripod when it's fully extended. When this is fully extended with the ball head, with the camera and the lens, that it stays just below eye level. I don't want to have to stand on my tiptoes in order to see through the camera. So I want to make sure that it's not too low and not too high. Each manufacturer is going to be able to list everything about the tripod, the specs, how it packs up, the size that it is when it's packed up, and the size that it is when it's fully extended. So make sure to check that and research it thoroughly before making your final purchase. I prefer to have my tripods just below my eye line, so I just have to look down just a little bit without bending over to look through it. Some people like to get tripods that are much taller than they are so they can set up on lower positions and stand up on higher positions. I like to be able to fully extend my tripod and have it be perfect every time on the same plane that I'm standing on. As we start to get into the basics of photography, there's no way that I can teach you guys everything, but I just want to touch on the basics, the essentials that you need to know before we get out into the field. And the first thing that I want to cover is what's called the exposure triangle and the 3 settings on your camera that you're going to find yourself changing the most. And those 3 things are ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop. Let's start by talking about ISO. And for landscape photography and throughout the duration of this tutorial, you guys are going to see me shooting at the lowest ISO possible. And here's why. The lower the ISO number, the less noise is in my image. So an ISO of 100 is nearly noise free, where an ISO of 1600 or 3200 is going to have a lot of grain and a lot of noise in the image. Essentially, all ISO is the camera sensor's sensitivity to light. So the more sensitive it becomes, the higher that ISO number, the more prone it becomes to noise. Much like some lenses have a fixed aperture rating, cameras usually have a minimum and maximum ISO. So a lot of these cameras, like my Nikon D810, is 100, and that's expandable to a low 30 at low 1.0 settings. So it allows me to go even lower and have even less noise in my images. On the high side of the spectrum, most cameras allow you to go up to ISO 6400 or well beyond. But for this entire tutorial, you guys are not going to see me shoot anywhere higher than ISO 200. All digital images have some noise in the background, but with very low ISOs, we never see it. When you increase the ISO, you amplify the light on the sensor, and it also amplifies the noise, adding some speckling to the image. We've all seen the effect of noise on our images, especially when we're using our mobile devices in low light environments. But check out the scene that I've shot. Check it out at ISO 200 compared to ISO 3200. You can see there's a huge difference in the noise value. Now that noise is going to increase and decrease as I change that ISO value up and down. Now ISO is one of the 3 elements along with f-stop and shutter speed that we're trying to balance to get a correct exposure, but a good rule of thumb is to always try to keep the ISO as low as possible. The next thing I want to cover is f-stop, which is also called aperture, and it's essentially the size of the opening when the image is shot. All of these lenses have the aperture built into the back of the lens. So depending on my camera settings, that's going to determine how much light is allowed into the camera. So for example, this is an f2.8 fixed lens. Now f2.8 means that's the highest maximum aperture, even though it's the smallest number. The lowest aperture on this is f22, even though that's the highest number. And that reason is because at f2.8, the amount of light that comes in is the largest. It's the most open. So even though the number's smaller, it's actually a higher aperture. At f22, it's a tiny hole in the back of the lens here. That's why it's called the lowest. Since the aperture controls the amount of light that's coming into the camera, when it's wide open, it's at its largest value, so the most light comes into the camera. When it's closed down to f22, it's a very small opening, so only a small amount of light can enter the camera. Shooting at f2.8 and f22 both have distinct advantages and disadvantages, and we're going to be covering that a little bit later. For the duration of this tutorial, I'm mostly going to be shooting at f8 to f11, and I'll explain why. Before getting into the problems that we have at different apertures, I always try to shoot at the lens's sweet spot. And that's typically for each lens, you can find that perfect point right around f8. But a good rule of thumb is that it's 2 to 3 stops down from the lens's lowest fixed aperture. So right now, this is an f2.8 lens. So it starts to get sharp right around f4 or 5.6. If you have a 5.6 lens, it's going to start getting sharp right around f8. Now don't worry if that doesn't make sense right now. I'll have more time to talk about it in the future as well. So right now we've covered 2 things. We've covered ISO and f-stop, which both control the overall exposure. And for the duration of this tutorial, I'm going to be keeping it pretty simple, shooting around f8, or at least trying to keep it right around that range. The third setting that's going to determine the overall exposure of your images is shutter speed. Now, if aperture is the amount of light that's entering the camera, the shutter speed is how long the shutter stays open and exposes that light. Most cameras will go as fast as 1/4000 or 1/8000, which means that's 1/4000th or 8000th of a second. They'll also go as slow as 30 seconds, and you can change it anywhere between that value. Most cameras lock you into a maximum exposure time of 30 seconds unless you use a different feature called bulb mode. Bulb mode allows you to time your own exposures, and in this tutorial we'll be sometimes breaking the limits of the camera, timing our own exposures in bulb mode to exceed the 30 seconds into the 1-minute exposure mark. The shutter speed on all cameras is represented by a fraction. So if I see 500 on my LCD or on the top of my camera, that means 1/500 or 1/500th of a second. 500 is pretty obvious as 1/500th of a second, but it can get a little bit confusing when you see 30. If you just see the number 30, that's 1/30th of a second. If you see the number 30 with 2 tick marks to the right of it, that means 30 seconds. Now obviously, 1/1000th of a second is a much faster shutter speed than 1/10, which is a tenth of a second. So a higher number for the shutter speed on your camera represents less light coming into your camera because it's a really fast exposure, where a lower number means that you're having a longer exposure and more light is entering the camera. As landscape photographers, we have a distinct advantage because we're shooting on a tripod. We're able to extend the shutter speeds pretty much as long as we want because our camera stays in a stationary position. If you're shooting handheld, you're going to have faster shutter speeds because if you shoot handheld with a slower shutter speed, you can end up with motion blur as the camera moves. So where most photographers who are holding their cameras don't want to shoot anywhere below a 1/60th of a second, we can shoot up to 4 minutes, and since we're on a tripod, we can still end up with a tack sharp image. The total advantage with this is that we can lock our f-stop and our ISOs to our perfect values and not be so concerned with our shutter speeds because it doesn't really matter so much. We can go as short or as long as we want with our shutter speeds. In some cases in this tutorial, we'll even extend our shutter speeds to much further values by introducing neutral density filters, which limit the amount of light that are coming into the camera and are independent of changing the ISO and the f-stop. Now that we've discussed the 3 things that make up the exposure triangle, let's discuss what a stop of light actually is. Throughout this whole tutorial, you guys are going to hear me say things like let's stop up or let's stop down or let's increase by 2 stops or decrease by 2 stops. So let's get on the same page right now and figure out exactly what that means. It may be surprising to you, but a lot of photographers actually don't know this. At the very simplest terms, a stop of light just means this. If I increase by 1 stop of light, I'm going to double the exposure. If I decrease 1 stop of light, I'm going to half it. Each time that I do that, I'm going to double it again, or half it again, and half it again. So let's say that we start at ISO 800. If I wanted to increase 1 stop, I double it to 1600. Increase 2 stops, and I'd be going up to 3200. Go back to 800. If I wanted to decrease a stop of light, that 800 would turn into 400, then 200, then 100, then 50, then 25. Each time you want to increase or decrease a full stop of light, you have to double or half that ISO value. Now let's talk about the f-stop, and when we're dealing with full stops of light, this is probably the most confusing attribute to understand, but let's start right at the middle at f8, which is my favorite number. From f8, if I want to increase the amount of light coming into the lens, I'm going to have to stop up, which actually means decreasing the number to 5.6, which actually changes the aperture size to a larger opening. From f5.6, if I want to stop up again, it would go to f4, stop up one more time at f2.8. Now let's go back to f8. If I wanted to decrease the light by one stop, I'd actually stop down, which means I'm going to get a higher number. So f8 becomes f11, one more stop will be f16, and then f22. I know this can be a little confusing because remember, the lower the f-stop number, the higher the aperture, and the larger the f-stop number, the lower the aperture. So it gets a little bit confusing when you're saying stopping up or stopping down, but over time, this will become second nature. Just like we can change a stop of light with f-stop and ISO, we can also do it with shutter speed, and it's actually really simple. Let's say that we have a shutter speed of 1/1000, and we want to increase by one stop of light. It would simply half to 1/500. Again, 1/250. So every time for a full stop of light, you're gonna double it or half that value. Starting again at 1,000th of a second, if I wanted less light in the camera, I'd go to a 2,000th and then a 4,000th of a second. It's important to note that these days, some cameras allow us to change stops between 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, or even full stops, and that can usually be changed in the menu in your camera system. For this tutorial, I'm gonna try to work with only half and full stops to make it easy to understand. Here's where it starts to get really fun. We can add neutral density filters to control the amount of light that's coming into the camera independent of ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed. And here's how it works. Let's say I've changed all the settings in my camera and the slowest shutter speed I can get is 1 second, but I want to increase that dramatically. Well, this is a 10-stop neutral density filter. So let's count up. If I were to put this on the front of my camera, and my camera right now is metering a 1-second exposure, let's see what 10 stops from 1 second would be. And bear in mind, that's going to be doubling this value. So 1 second becomes 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 16 seconds, 32 seconds, 64, and on and on and on and on until I have a ridiculously long exposure. So this is really nice because these come in different ratings. This is a 10 stop, but I also work with a 4 stop that allows me to manipulate the shutter speed further independent of the settings in the camera. Another clear advantage of using neutral density filters on your camera is they allow you to stay at your favorite settings in your lens's sweet spot. So instead of increasing from f8 up to f22, where we'll start to get some of those negative effects, all we can do is manipulate the amount of light coming into the front of the camera with one of these instead. Now that we've covered the basic settings, it's time to get into the specific shooting modes of our cameras. On most cameras, you're going to have a fully automatic mode that you're going to be able to select that will control everything for you. On some Canon cameras, it's a green little square. On some Nikon cameras, it's a green little camera. On my D810, it's actually called P mode or program mode. Setting my camera to P mode allows me to control the ISO, but it will control both the f-stop and the shutter speed. I never shoot in P mode because I want to have control of those attributes. Most cameras also have a few semi-automatic modes, and those are both shutter priority and aperture priority. Let's talk about shutter priority first. Shutter priority, conveniently enough, is usually an S on the camera, and that's going to allow me to have control over the shutter speed, and the camera is automatically going to pick the appropriate f-stop based on the light meter inside the camera. I never use this mode in my camera. Instead, I use aperture priority because it gives me control over both the aperture and the ISO, and the camera determines the shutter speed. Remember that since we're locking everything down on a tripod, the shutter speed doesn't matter as much. The last mode to talk about is full manual mode, or M mode on the Nikon, and that allows me to have control over everything. The camera will do nothing for me. While M mode can be a little bit more advanced, we will be using it in this tutorial when we need precise control over everything, especially when we're doing timed exposures or long exposures in bulb mode. Throughout our time together in the field in this tutorial, you guys are going to be seeing me use aperture priority quite a bit. And the reason is in these environments, in these landscape environments, the lighting changes constantly. So once I set the ISO value and the f-stop value that I want, the shutter speed will change and adapt itself as the light changes, where in manual mode, I have to keep adapting it myself. Aperture priority mode is also really great when you start using exposure bracketing. Now that we've talked about the different shooting modes, when we're shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority mode, the camera's going to try to meter the light perfectly. So if we want to over or underexpose, we have to use something called an EV shift. Now the Nikon's really easy to use. You just press the EV shift button and roll the thumb slider to the right and to the left, and you're going to see a plus and a minus come up. So this will override the camera meter settings and give you a stop up or a stop down of light. On the Fujifilm, it's even easier. All I have to do is spin this thumb dial to the left or the right to compensate. Now keep in mind, in full manual mode, I have complete control over this, and the EV shift will actually do nothing. When shooting in dynamic lighting environments or situations when it's really bright or really dark, sometimes the camera meter won't really know how to meter correctly, so you're going to have to use this EV shift to get a proper exposure. Most cameras these days are going to be able to shoot in all the modes that we've just talked about. But just bear in mind that every camera manufacturer is completely different, and even every model from those camera manufacturers is different as well. So the buttons are going to be in different places, and the way to change between these settings are all going to be in different places too. So make sure you familiarize yourself with your specific camera settings so you know how to change all of these things that we've talked about. So now that we've covered the very basics of photography and functions, let's take it to the next level and talk about how your choice of f-stop can dramatically change the look of the final image. I've already talked a little bit about finding the lens's sweet spot, so this being an f2.8 lens, if I stop down 2 to 3 stops, it becomes razor sharp at f5.6, which is why I like to shoot right around f8, because I know that I'm going to get the sharpest possible image at the center of the lens there. It's time to talk specifically about how the f-stop changes the depth of field in your images. In the context of landscape photography, choosing the right f-stop is going to be the key to getting the sharpest images possible. This is one of my favorite lenses, the Nikon 14-24. It allows me to shoot at a very low f2.8, which allows so much light into the camera. It's also called shooting wide open on this lens. Now obviously that allows a lot of light into the camera, so it makes it perfect for shooting the night sky, for example, but it also creates a really shallow depth of field. Now, what is depth of field exactly? Essentially, depth of field is how much of a scene is going to be in focus. As landscape photographers, it's very important that our images are sharp in every part of the frame. If you're a different type of photographer or a wedding photographer, it's different. You want things to be soft. You want parts of the face to be soft and the background to be blurry. That's when an f2.8 really comes in handy. But for landscape photography, it can be very problematic because some of the scene will be soft. Not only that, f2.8 also has the ability to soften the edges of the image as well. So here's an example of the same image shot at f2.8 and f8, and let's zoom in and examine the differences. As you can see, the f8 version is much sharper around the edges. So if stopping down from f2.8 to f8 will create a sharper image, then it also makes sense that going to f22 will create an even sharper image and give me an even wider depth of field. While that's true that going to f22 will give you wider depth of field and sharper edges on the image, it also causes a negative effect called diffraction. When you get past your lens's sweet spot, you actually get the negative effects of stopping down to 16 or 22. Now what happens with diffraction is since you have such a small aperture, so much light has to squeeze through the front of the camera that it actually creates a negative effect of the softening of your edges. So while f22 will make everything sharper, diffraction will mitigate or take away from that same sharpness. Another problem with f22 is you'll see every defect on the front of your sensor. In most cases pertaining towards landscape photography, that means every dust and dirt speck on the lens. So it's tons of cleanup work that you'll have to do in Photoshop when you shoot at f22. So we know our lens's sweet spot, and if we deviate from that too much, then we're going to get some other negative effects as well, and that one is vignetting. So right around f8, we usually get 0 vignetting, f22, we get really strong vignetting, and f2.8, we also get vignetting. So at f2.8, we get a very shallow depth of field. At f22, we get a very wide depth of field, but we also get diffraction. So you want to be very careful to try to stay in that sweet spot on your lens so that you can get the best balance of sharpness throughout the image. I mentioned vignetting, and all vignetting essentially is the darkening around the edges of the image. In fact, it's an effect that a lot of photographers put on their photography in portraiture and wedding photography, where you have dark around the frame. At the sweet spot of your lens, you don't really have any vignetting, but when it's at f2.8 or f22, you get a lot of vignetting. In Lightroom or any raw processing engine that you happen to use, it's a really easy thing to remove. One thing to note that's very important if you're shooting wide open at f2.8 and you're getting soft edges, or you're shooting at f22 and the diffraction is also causing you to get soft edges, is that no matter what megapixels you have, if you have 5 megapixels or 50, a soft image is always going to be a soft image. So it's important to get the right balance in camera for the best quality in your images. That covers the basics of the camera settings and functions, but there's still a few things we're going to want to do to assure that we're getting the best images possible out of our camera. These features are usually in the menu system in the cameras, and the first thing that I want to talk about is RAW versus JPEG. Most cheap cameras, including cell phones and mobile devices, all shoot in JPEG. JPEG is a super compressed 8-bit version of an image that can be shared on the internet, but it's very hard to edit because it's very, very compressed. Shooting in RAW is going to allow us to have complete control over the look of our images in post-processing and have the best quality overall. So in the back of your camera, in the menu system, make sure to shoot in the highest quality RAW file as possible. If I were to shoot everything in JPEG, and let's say I had a completely blown out sky or a dark foreground, I would not be able to recover any of that data in post-processing. It doesn't exist. But if I shoot in RAW, I should be able to recover that. And what I thought was lost will actually be there, and I'll have full control over the look of the image. Now, this is a huge topic and very hard to understand all on its own, but most consumer grade cameras give you the option to either shoot in sRGB or Adobe RGB. Now, sRGB is sort of the engine for JPEGs on the internet, but Adobe RGB is actually a wider color gamut. Now, what does that exactly mean? It means that there are more colors in the visible spectrum captured in a RAW file that has Adobe RGB settings as opposed to sRGB. So if you capture something with sRGB, you'll never be able to turn it into something that has a wide gamut like Adobe RGB. So the best practice is always to shoot in the highest quality RAW with the highest quality color settings, because if you capture the highest quality settings, you can always compress it down to lower settings and smaller sizes. But it's better to start with the best settings possible. There has never been one moment in time where I have been capturing sRGB unless somebody accidentally changed my camera and handed it back to me and I didn't know about it. It's always in Adobe RGB. But one thing to note about working in Adobe RGB, and we're going to cover this in the post-processing session, when we put our work online in JPEG format, it's important to convert it to sRGB first because it'll preview correctly. Sometimes people shoot in Adobe RGB and then they upload things to the internet and the colors look a little bit off. That's because the browsers actually do not read Adobe RGB, they read sRGB. So again, we'll be covering that in a future section. Throughout this tutorial, we're going to be shooting in RAW, but we're also going to be adjusting the white balance. The cool thing about shooting in RAW is that we can change the white balance later, but it's still important to get it right in camera. So we're going to be using a combination of auto white balance on our cameras and actually manual white balance, which allows us to change the color temperature from cool to warm. And it's very cool because the lower number that you go gets cooler, the higher number gets warmer. And this really gives us complete control over the overall tone of our image. So we're going to try to get it as close to perfect in camera as possible, but we're also going to be making adjustments in post-processing as well. If you're shooting in JPEG, the white balance is pretty much locked in. You have to do it with a color correction, but when you're shooting RAW, it's built into all the RAW processors. With a simple slider, we can change it just like we did in camera. Now, I know this may seem like it's a lot of information to cover, but it's important that we're all on the same page with these basic and intermediate camera functions. But before we move on, there's a few things that I want to talk about that are going to become recurring themes throughout this tutorial. Mainly, that's going to be the blending of time or using exposure bracketing. Sometimes a single exposure isn't enough. So throughout this tutorial, we're going to be using a combination of either auto exposure bracketing or time blending. Auto exposure bracketing is a pretty simple concept because it's an automatic function in the camera, and I can set my camera to automatically expose correctly and then shoot 1, 2, or 3 over and under automatically. So it'll shoot a -3, 2, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to get a wide range of exposures covered that I can then use in post-processing to blend together into a perfectly exposed image. So I may be combining certain portions of a sunset with certain portions of a twilight or a blue hour. It's going to give me the ability to take multiple shots over time and then blend them back together into a single image. Now don't worry if this sounds complex right now because we're going to be covering it throughout the duration of this tutorial. We've covered a lot of settings, and even though we're going to be on a tripod 100% of the time, it's still important to never disrupt the camera. And believe it or not, just pressing the shutter button can disrupt the camera enough to ruin the frame by adding a little bit of motion blur. So throughout this tutorial, we're either going to be using a remote trigger to trigger it without touching the camera, or we're going to be using our camera's built-in timer. And that allows us to just set a few second delay from the time that we press the button to when the exposure takes place. Shooting landscapes, it's also important to make sure that the horizon is level all the time. And depending on the landscape, you might be dealing with mountains or sloping hills or different things like that, so it's impossible to gauge exactly where the horizon is. That's why I really love to use the built-in camera level function. And cameras these days are getting really accurate. Both the Nikon D810 and my Fuji X-T1 have great built-in levelers, so I can see how offset things are. And a lot of the times I'll try to level everything perfect in camera just using the viewfinder, and then I turn on the built-in leveling and I see that I'm actually off, so I'm able to adjust it through the LCD screen. As you can see, it's not only a level, but it's a 3-dimensional level, so it shows me what my pitch and angle is so that I can perfectly level it. And once it turns green, it means that it's level, and it also shows me how much the camera is elevated or pointed down. Now let's talk a little bit about focusing and how to properly focus your camera to get the sharpest image possible. Now this may seem like a simple concept, but it's probably the most important thing. Because if you end up with a blurry image, it doesn't matter how expensive your camera is, what kind of camera you're using, how high of a megapixel it is, it's still a ruined image. With a DSLR camera, there are 2 options for autofocus. You can either focus through the viewfinder or you can focus through the LCD screen. Now you will get a much more accurate focus if you focus through the LCD screen, but you need to take it a step further than that. So remember, I love to shoot at f8, but I can get a better focus at f2.8 or f4, whatever the maximum aperture is of my lens. So when I focus on a tripod, I always switch to the live view and I zoom in to some point of contrast, whether that's the edge of a tree, the edge of a building, or just something that has high contrast. I go all the way down to my maximum aperture rating. In this case, it would be f4, and then I autofocus there. Then I change my settings back to my optimal f-stop, which is usually f8, before I shoot. If I rely on the viewfinder, it will usually be off a little bit. I know that's a little bit funny, but for some reason, these cameras work better focusing through the live view. If you have a mirrorless camera, it doesn't matter because it's a digital live view and it's a digital viewfinder, so they're both exactly the same. So you don't have to worry about it, but it's still good practice to go down to maybe f2.8 or whatever the maximum aperture rating is on your lens, because that's going to give you a better true focus value. A key difference between a DSLR and a mirrorless camera is mirrorless cameras have focus peaking when you're manually focusing. This is a very powerful feature because it'll show you edge highlights of the elements that are in focus in the camera. And as you twist the focus ring, you can actually see that change in real time. On the DSLR, you kind of have to squint or get something to magnify the back of the LCD to make sure that it's perfectly in focus. So that's a very powerful feature of the mirrorless system. For most of what we're going to be shooting in this tutorial, we're going to be shooting at wide angles and things are going to be very far away from the lens. So most of the time we're going to be focusing at infinite or very close to infinite. But what happens if we zoom in a little bit, and what happens if something is really close to the camera? Then we have an issue where we have to decide what to focus on, either the foreground element or either the background infinite element. In order to correct for something like that, I like to use a technique called focus stacking. And what I do with focus stacking is I actually take one shot for the background focus, one shot for the foreground focus, and I actually blend them together in Photoshop so that everything is perfectly sharp throughout. In these type of shooting scenarios, some photographers like to use something called the hyperfocal distance. And the basic idea behind calculating the hyperfocal distance is finding the sweet spot, the position of where to focus somewhere in the middle of your scene so that your foreground and your background becomes acceptably sharp. Let's say, for example, that we're shooting some flowers in the foreground, and then there's a lake in the middle ground, and then there's mountains in the background. Well, chances are the hyperfocal distance is going to be somewhere around that lake, and if I focus on that point, the flowers are going to be mostly focused, and the background is going to be mostly focused, but nothing except for that middle ground is going to be fully focused. It's actually going to fall off in focus as it gets further and closer towards the camera. Now, this is a way to get everything mostly in focus in one shot. It also has to do with your f-stop, your focal length, the camera you're using, and the distance away that the objects are from your camera. All that has to be taken into consideration, and then you can calculate the optimum point to focus on based on all those settings. But since we're not mathematicians, there are plenty of apps out there that can calculate it for you if you want to use it. To calculate the hyperfocal distance, I like to use the app called PhotoPills. It's available on the iPhone, Android, and iPad. It's really easy to use. Once you input your camera, and I've inputted the Fujifilm X-T1 here, it gives you a really easy table to use where you can pick your millimeter. You see it on the left. I'll say 35 millimeter, and I'll say it f8, and it'll actually say that my hyperfocal distance at those settings is 7.69 meters away. And as I start to change that and go up to say something like 70 millimeter, now you can see that it's 30 meters away. But very quickly, if I start to go down to, let's say, 10, which is a lens that I like to use a lot, and I shoot at f8, you can see that it's 0.63 meters, so nearly infinite throughout. So it's a really good way to just kind of see what you can get away with. And if you need to calculate the hyperfocal distance and you want to experiment with it on your own, or you don't like post-processing at all and you don't want to blend two images together, this may be a good place to start. It also becomes very difficult to use the hyperfocal distance point because you have to use a precise measurement. It may say 6 meters in front of your camera is going to be the hyperfocal point, but sometimes it's really hard to determine exactly how far that 6 meter distance is. So unless you're really good with measurement or you happen to carry a tape measure, it can be very difficult to use. Since we're shooting at wide angles primarily and they have a very wide depth of field, we're not going to run into this problem very often, but there are going to be specific situations where I'm going to show you guys how to use focus stacking to overcome those issues. Since I've mentioned infinite focus, there's something really important to note about cameras, is most cameras and most lenses, I should say specifically, like Nikon and Canon lenses, have a window here on the top of the lens where you can actually see the distance that you're focusing to, and you have the little infinity sign. Now, the frustrating thing about these lenses is you can actually focus past infinite. So I don't know how things can be infinity plus one, but apparently these camera manufacturers think that makes sense, but it actually doesn't. Usually the focus for infinity isn't exactly dead center of infinity. It's a little bit turned to the right of infinity, which is very frustrating, and each lens is different. If you have a 14-24, yours is going to be a little bit different than mine. So with the new cameras, once you get the autofocus set in your live view and you have it down to f2.8 or f4, it should be able to calculate that for you pretty easily, and it's a good thing to memorize. That way you can quickly set it to infinite anytime just by a visual cue. If you happen to use Zeiss lenses always stop dead center of infinite, and that's the 100% infinite value. So it makes them much easier to use when you're calculating the total infinite distance. Knowing each one of your lenses' infinite focal point is really important, especially when you wake up really early. We're going to be getting up before dawn way too many times that I want to count here, but there's going to be nothing to focus on in the dark. So it's going to be crucial for me to know exactly where to twist this and exactly where my infinite point is in order to get razor sharp images when I can't focus on anything. While all of these settings that I've talked about are really important for crafting beautiful imagery, the single most important element in photography is the light. Other types of photographers have the luxury of crafting their own light or working in studios in what I call a controlled lighting environment. In landscape photography, that lighting changes all day long, and it's a dynamic lighting environment that we have to adapt to and use to our advantage. Think about some of the most beautiful landscape photos you've ever seen. What do most of them have in common? Chances are they're shot right around sunrise or the time just after sunrise or sunset and that golden light just before sunset. That's when the lighting is the best. It has a golden and soft quality to it. You don't want to shoot things at high noon or the middle of the day because the lighting's harsh. If the sun's just bearing down on a landscape, you have so much contrast between the highlights and the shadows that you have all these black edges of shadows everywhere. But when the sun is low in the sky, it just casts beautiful, soft light. And while it gives you longer shadows, they're also softer and more diffuse, giving you a more well-balanced image overall. So sunrise and sunset, those are two things that we've all experienced in our life, unless we happen to be vampires, and that's a completely different problem. But there's a few times that happen around sunrise and sunset that are also beautiful, and those are the golden hours. So after the sun comes up, before it gets through a certain elevation in the sky, they call it the golden hour. It can last 15 minutes or up to 2 hours if you're close to the North or the South Pole. But effectively, this is where the sun has two really nice qualities. It has a golden quality of light because of the atmospheric perspective and that atmospheric haze that sits low on the horizon that gives it a nice, soft feel. It also hasn't elevated in the sky enough to where it's causing harsh shadows. If you flip to the other side of the day, just before the sunset, the same thing starts to happen just before the sun dips below the horizon. So that's what the golden hours are. But we're also going to be utilizing some other times of day that you might not be familiar with. And those are the blue hours. So you have both an AM and a PM blue hour. Let's talk about the post-sunset blue hour. Once the sun goes down, there's still ambient light in the sky that starts to diminish as time goes on. So an early blue hour is just after the sun sets, and a late blue hour is just before the sky turns completely dark. Now this is a really great time for photography because there's still enough blue in the sky that you get all the ambient light still lighting softly the foreground. When it becomes full dark, there is no more ambient light and no more light on the foreground. Now that's how the PM blue hour works. The AM blue hour works just the opposite. So way before sunset, it's full dark, then it starts to get slowly and slowly and slowly more light in the sky to where you get a blue hour just before the sun rises. Now obviously it's easier to make it in time for the post-sunset blue hour than it is for the pre-sunrise blue hour because you don't have to get up severely early in the morning. Obviously, everything that we're talking about with the sun has to do with seasonal variations. In the summertime, near the solstice, we have really long days and really long sunsets because the sun is rising and setting really slow. In the winter months, especially when we're in the severe north or the severe south, we may only have a 6-hour day. So everything changes based on the season and the position of the globe, and that's all something you should take into consideration when planning your shots. In this tutorial, we've selected the best of both worlds. We've gone to Iceland where we have extremely short days and the sun never gets too far above the horizon, so we have perpetual soft light. We've also gone down to the southern hemisphere in New Zealand. We're in the peak of summer where we were in the peak of winter in Iceland, so it's completely different. We have really long days and an abundance of sun. In this way, we're able to give you a very well-rounded scope of different landscapes to shoot. Aside from the light that changes during the different seasons, the look changes dramatically as well. Iceland is kind of an anomaly because it's always a bunch of shades of brown. But here in New Zealand in the summertime, we have a lot of growth. Some of the grass has turned brown, but we still have some wildflowers. Obviously, during fall, we get fall colors. Winter, we get snow. And then in spring, we get fresh flowers and green landscapes. So seasons play a key role in the way that the light works, but they also play a key role in the distinct look of the environment based on the vegetation that's either growing or covered in snow. In some cases, there are locations that I visit year after year to work on specific shots. My favorite place to do this is Japan during the cherry blossom season. Each time I visit, I work on a particular shot, but it's very difficult because that cherry bloom only lasts about a week and weather can completely destroy it. Since light is the most important thing in my photography, I'd say the second most important thing is the sky. And I love to have dramatic light and dramatic clouds. And it's important to understand which parts of the world produce those types of conditions, no matter what season you're in. So for example, I love being in Europe during the summertime, but in Central Europe and Southern Europe in the summertime, it is pretty much a static blue sky. There really are no clouds in Rome, for example, until September or October. If you're there in July or August, you may have 30 perpetual days of blue sky, which makes it really horrible for photography. So it's important to take that into consideration. In other parts of the world, like Asia, for example, they have monsoon seasons. So while monsoon seasons obviously produce beautiful clouds, it can also rain for weeks or even months at a time. So for places like that, it's good to visit at a shoulder season. Usually in the summer, you get very little clouds, and then towards the winter or monsoon season, bear in mind this can be opposite depending whether you're north or south of the equator. The best rule of thumb is to usually visit on shoulder seasons, where you can have the best of both worlds. You get clouds with mixed rain and mixed sun. Partly cloudy skies tend to yield the best and most colorful sunrises and sunsets. As landscape photographers, it's very important for us to constantly look towards the skies, judge our seasons, but we also should always look for fantastic weather events. Fog, mist, mixed rain, sun rays, different things like that can all add uniqueness to our images. So it's important to experiment with all times of day dependent on the weather. If you have amazing weather events, take advantage of it, because that's when you can get the extremes and the most unique images you can possibly capture. We've talked a little bit about how seasons and sunlight dramatically affect your image, but also the positioning of the sun is also really important. If you want a fiery sky, a fiery sunset in your image, it's going to be important that that sun is setting right in your frame as opposed to behind you. So what I use is a combination of two different apps to calculate my sunrise time and position and sunset time and position to 100% accuracy. I've already shown you guys PhotoPills, which does this very same feature, but the one that I've been using the longest is called the Photographer's Ephemeris. It's only a few dollars in the App Store. It also works online, and it allows you to calculate your position, and then as you slide, it'll actually show you the sunrise position, the time, how the sun spins throughout the day, and exactly where and when it sets. Now you can get this to track the specific day that you're shooting, or you can go well into the future and you can plan your shots months in advance. We've covered a lot of information in this section, so it's time to take it to the next step and work in the field. I'm gonna pack up all this gear, we're gonna get on the plane, and we're gonna head to Iceland and get all of this started.